how does one approach chamber music? Because for some people it can be very erudite, and others it feels very natural. And I wanted your viewpoint on that.
Sure, absolutely. I think the point on which to start with chamber music is that you note that there is a single player on each part, unlike an orchestra. And yet it is not the same kind of power dynamic that you might have in a concerto, where there is a clear soloist who the spotlight is on, and the orchestra who is in the back, pretty much accompanying the soloist. So I feel like you really have something that's in between a concerto, which displays a clear power dynamic, and perhaps just a symphony where you have 70 to 100 people working together with the assistance of a conductor usually to bring a whole mass of sound and compositions together. I don't know if it's the fairest thing to say that the chamber music genre then fits right in between, but it's at least a starting point to think about. I would probably say that Mozart, his operas are very famous, his symphonies are very famous. Even though he only wrote 24 quartets, and Haydn actually wrote 68, so he only actually, quantity-wise, of course, wrote only a third of what Haydn was able to produce. They're so loved and so famous. I would probably argue that he's just as famous in the vocal and the operatic and the symphonic, in the concerti, the violin.
Good generalist.
Yes, yes,
Covered
absolutely.
all mediums.
Very talented, obviously. The String Quartet 421 is also one of the most mature quartets that is in a minor key. The opening theme, if you're familiar with it, actually is pretty dark, which is unusual, I think, for Mozart's quartets, especially for an opening, especially for a key. You would not find a comparable amount of darkness in Haydn's quartets. A lot of historians have noted that perhaps this is kind of a precursor to the Sturm und Drang movement, equivalent in literature, the kinds of storm and stress, the passions that would be very characteristic in the Romantic era. With the Schumann, I was interested to note, again, as I was saying earlier, that this was an experimentation in form and it constituted an expansion of form for Schumann because he was singularly a pianist at that time. And only at Clara, his wife's urging, did he then try to experiment with string writing and with form. The Mozart is in sonata allegro form, which would constitute another hour to delineate all of the forms, but that was very much the characteristic form of that time. Schumann, being an early romantic, was very much concerned in an expansion of that form, to not have such clear-cut lines, to not have two differing themes, for instance, which is very characteristic of sonata allegro form, and you will see also in the Mozart.
Is it a happier piece than the Mozart?
It is definitely a happier piece.
Which, I like happy pieces.
Yes. Shostakovich, as you all know, is a 20th century composer. He lived in the Soviet Union. He was very much under pressures to basically write pieces that supported the communist regime. He was very much in favor when Trotsky was in power, but as soon as Stalin took power, he ran into a bit of trouble, but he wasn't the only composer, of course. Unlike Schumann, who was experimenting with larger forms, and he considered the string quartet a larger form, Shostakovich actually would have considered the string quartet to be a smaller, pared-down form for him, because early in his life he experimented with large forms, symphonies, for instance, operas. And so to that regard, of course, minimizing your music to 4 lines would be considered a kind of downsizing. Shostakovich is also known to include certain monograms and puzzles. It's, of course, of debate whether the audience is supposed to pick it up and consider it essential to dissecting the music.
As a player, you played violin for a long time, and one of our preeminent violinists here in our community, if not the country. What do these pieces say to you as a player, and which ones have you played, and what are maybe some nuggets that we should be looking for from a player's perspective?
Well, for me, it's hard to denote what exactly. I mean, in an effort to simplify, of course, I think we end up actually complicating things. But I think for me, the most important thing as a player would be to understand the context in which these pieces were written, even if these pieces were not solely autobiographical accounts of a composer. I think it's inevitable that some trace of their soul, some trace of the social, historical context will be embedded in these pieces. To know that, for me at least, despite a lot of joys that these men all experienced in their lives, to know to some degree that there was actually a lot of tragedy in their lives makes a difference for me as a player. It adds a certain kind of weight, certainly, that I think can be a source of profound meaning, actually. It doesn't have to just be a dark exploration, but to know that in some ways, the kinds of experiences that these composers had, the difficulties that they've had, certainly there's a universal thread, but there's also something extremely specific about these pieces. As a listener, I think what's interesting is to see the unfolding of these episodes in time, how that, for instance, if the movements were so clear, each movement holds a very firm character, but for the Shostakovich, where it's, in a way, sonically, it seems like a huge single movement quartet, how do these different emotions play out in time?
The different moods as they evolve together.
Exactly, and especially with Shostakovich.
We were so lucky to have this opportunity to bring the Berlin Philharmonic Quartet here. This is a different ensemble. This ensemble, they are part of a larger group, and I have felt for many years, if you're going to do a battle of the bands from an orchestra perspective, the Berlin Philharmonic is going to rank probably 1 or 2 in the world, depending on whether you love the Viennese, Vienna Philharmonic or the Berlin Philharmonic. These players have played along in the tooth in those orchestras. So that must have some kind of influence,
Yes, absolutely.
on their playing styles, because they play in an orchestra, and then they go out and play as a group, as a chamber music ensemble. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are about that.
Absolutely. For me, maybe it goes without saying, but the interpretation and the sound is what excites me about this group. And to know that they're so well versed, your role as an orchestral musician is very different than a chamber musician. And that perhaps brings us back to square one when we were saying, how does the chamber music genre fit in with other types of genres? And one possible way to conceive of it, of course, is to say that it's somewhere in between a concerto and a symphony. But of course, there's many different ways to conceive of it as well.
For those of you who have perfect pitch, be warned, they're flawless.